As my dwelling place, I choose with greatest of reverence and love the transcendental abode of Sri Krishna. All those places where my Lord Gaurachandra travelled for pastimes, I will visit in the company of loving devotees. My mind always begs for the opportunity to hear the music of the mridanga. Upon hearing the kind of kirtan ordained by the Lord Gaurachandra, my heart dances in ecstasy. By beholding the deity forms of the divine couple Sri Sri Radha Krishna, I feel the greatest joy. By honoring the Lord's prasadam, I conquer over all worldly illusions. Golok Vrindavan appears in my home when I see the worship and the service of Lord Hari going on there. Upon the seeing the Ganges, which is the river of the nectar emanating from the lotus feet of Lord, my happiness knows no bound. The sight of the holy Tulsi tree soothes my soul, for I know she gives pleasure to Lord Krishna. By honoring Shak, a green leafy vegetable preparation, a dear favorite of Lord Chaitanya, I consider life worthwhile. Whatever Bhakti Vinod obtains that is conducive for the service of Sri Krishna, he accepts every day with greatest joy. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jai Gopi Jana Vallabha Girivaradhari Yashodanandana Braja Janaranjana Jamuna Tira Vanachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jayo Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Jayam Vishnupad Paramhams Parivrajagacharya Ashtotar Shatashri Srimad His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jayam Vishnupad Paramhams Parivrajagacharya Ashtotar Shatashri Srimad His Divine Grace Bhakti Siddhant Saraswati Goswami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita Ki all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories to assembled devotees, all glories, all glories, all glories to Sri Guru and Gauranga. So today being Ekadashi, we will be reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrit, and before that we will recite prayers. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Preshtaya Bhutale Shrimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Nitinamine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Shri Shri Radha Madan Mohan Bhagwan Ki Shri Shri Gaur Nitai Ki Shri Shri Jagannath Baldev Subhadra Mai Ki Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrit by Satswarup Das Goswami Maharaj. This is volume 2 entitled Planting the Seed, chapter chapter 9, Stay High forever. This is conversation with Bob. I heard about the Kling, a book that was supposed to chart a person's course in life. So I got someone to do a reading for me. The direction was push upwards through darkness. I took it as a good sign, a spiritual sign. Then I purchased the East Village Other and I saw an article entitled Save Earth Now. There was a picture of the Swami. I had read in a book by a Sikh teacher that there could be no higher knowledge without a spiritual master. Every morning on his way to work, Bob used to pass by Swami's storefront. Curious, he stopped once and peered into the window, only to find an empty room with some straw mats on the floor and one of the Swamiji's boys. Oh, these people are Buddhist. And he thought the door had been open, and the boy came over and invited him in. No thanks, he said, thinking, I don't want anything to do with Buddhism. And he went on to his job. In a head shop one day, he had picked up one of the Swamiji's Bhagavatams and looked through it. And he thought it was too advanced, so he put it back down. After he read the article in the East Village Other, his interest increased. He thought that today might be the last Sunday of chanting in the park before the cold weather came. And so he went to the park hoping to find Swami and his chanters. His wife was beside him, pushing Eric in a stroller when he heard the clink of the hand cymbals and a chorus of rhythmic chanting from south side of the park. Thinking it must be Swami, he followed the sound while his wife took Eric to play on the swings. Alone now, Bob drew closer, moving into the crowd until he could see the Kirtan party and the Swamiji sitting under the tree. Bob stood among a crowd of hundreds unnoticed. Everything is happening because of me, thought 19-year-old Judy Kolslovsky. Everything I see is my own creation, and I am the supreme. Everything is mine. As the thought of being God obsessed her, Judy forgot her father and everything else. She was confused. If I am God, why can't I control everything? Why am I so fearful on LSD? Judy was a student at the City College of New York, majoring in the art and history. She was taking guitar lessons from the revered Gary Davis, the blues singer and a Christian preacher, who was teaching her the art of sad soul music. Today, however, under the influence of LSD, she had the overwhelming impression that she was God. She would had a fight with her father, who seemed cold and distant to her and couldn't understand her, and she had left her parents' home in the Bronx and traveled downtown. She was going to visit a girlfriend, and Tompkins Square Park happened to be on the way. While she reached the park, the kirtan was going on, but she couldn't see much because of the crowd. She waved her way in closer until she could see some men, one shaven headed, several bearded, dancing with upraised hand, and in the center she saw Swamiji sitting on the rug playing his drum. So these are the reflections of a few of the devotees when they came to Krishna consciousness earlier. It's 1966, in the initial year. This is October somewhere. So this was the time when the hippie movement was very ripe. That was the time most of the Americans were resorting to drugs and all kinds of various experiments in their life to stay high forever. Dan Clark was 25, thin, intense, horn rim, bespectacled, an event grand filmmaker, and his first film was entitled Rebirth. He was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War and was working at a home for children as alternative governmental service. He had been a member of the SDS and the War Registers League. He had been arrested during a protest demonstration and he had been suspended 1 week from his job for wearing a peace button and a black armband. He was into Buddhism, but he had lately been adding a little psychedelic seasoning. Everything is nothing and nothing is everything was his slogan. And he would go around chanting it like a mantra. But he was feeling that, at least psychologically, he needed a devotional tonic. His voidistic meditation was getting stale. So the Buddhist mantra of his was not helping him. The Buddhist mantra was everything is nothing and nothing is everything. Don had come to park today looking for the Swamiji and the chanting he had read about in the East Village other. He had seen the Swami before one evening a few months back. He had been waiting for a bus across the street from the Swami's storefront. He was on his way to a rehearsal for a mixed media show, and his friend had gone into Sam's Lucenorate for a moment when he noticed that in the storefront an orange robed Indian man with a shaven head was lecturing to a small group of young people. In Dan's word, when I saw him, I imagined myself walking across the street, going into the storefront, sitting down, and renouncing all worldly connections. But I thought to myself, it's only my imagination. After all, I am married and I'm on my way to rehearsal, and I don't know anything about the Swamiji anyway. So my friend and I got on the bus. But Dan lived only a few blocks away from the storefront, and now and then he would pass by. Once he had stood for several minutes on the sidewalk looking at the corner of the Srimad Bhagavatam taped onto the window. In the words of Dan, it showed an oval lotus with planets around it. And right then I was introduced to the idea of spiritual sensuality. And when I saw the painting of Lord Chaitanya and his associates in the window, they really threw me. I thought, yes, this is what I need, juice. So he started finding some juice in Krishna consciousness rather than having a stale understanding of Buddhist ideas. Dan and his wife walked the paved pathway through the park. He was looking around for the Swami, but he didn't really know what to look for. He expected to see robes and hear Buddhist style chanting, but he couldn't find anything. He had given up his search and was wandering around to see what musicians were there, and he noticed a big crowd gathered around when he figured must have been some musicians. He was attracted by the beat of their music, a chimming 1 2 3 1 2 3, a simple rhythm with a kind of flamboyance and very magnetic. He saw an occasional upraised arm above the crowd, and he thought that there must be flamenco dancing going on inside the circle. He then got wind of a drifting melody, certainly not flamenco, which accompanied the beat, and this attracted him further. He approached closer and closer, making his way through the crowd. Then he saw people chanting and others dancing and waving their arms in what he took to be a blend of American, Indian, and Asian dancing. It looked like something from a long forgotten era. Dan decided that this must be the Hare Krishna group, but there were no robes, just the regular dress of the Lower East Side. And where was the Swami? Then he saw him sitting inconspicuous, playing a little drum. His eyes were closed and his brow was knit with concentration. In the words of Dan, the Swami was calling attention to himself. And at the first, I didn't attribute any importance to an elderly Indian man sitting off to one side. He didn't seem to have any special function in the chanting. But it gradually dawned to me was who he was. He was the same Swami I had read about in the paper and seen in the storefront. After a while he spoke, but I couldn't hear him. Still, I was impressed that he was a very modest person, not interested in getting himself up on pedestal. He didn't go strutting around, but was still with inner peace, strength, and knowledge. Bob, all his disciples were around his feet. They were chanting, and I tried to chant along and learn the mantra too. I had heard the chanting of Hare Krishna once before at a peace march, and I found it very beautiful. Then the Swami spoke. I had the impression that this person was not earthly, and I thought, here is a person I am looking for. He seemed to be different from anyone else. Like he came from some other planet or universe, I was attracted. So these reflections of disciples who came to Krishna consciousness in the early phases of life, they remember very strongly. Even after many, many years, when we meet them, they clearly remember what exactly happened and they can narrate as if it has happened yesterday. So that was the impression Prabhupada left on these people. After a second kirtan, the Swami and his followers rolled up their rug, picked up their instruments, and began to leave. Bob walked back to the swings on the other side of the park to find his wife and child, but the image of Swami stayed with him. He seemed different from anyone else. His accent had been thick, yet Bob resolved to go to the storefronts in a few days and to hear him speak. Here is a leader, thought Bob. Dan and his wife sauntered off into the park, sampling the various groups of musicians. His wife was surprised that Dan, who was usually shy, had danced at Kirtan. He said he might go over to the storefront one day and hear Swami speak. Judy just stood there hallucinating. She had a Stay High Forever pamphlet in her hand and read it over and over and over. While she was thinking the whole event must have come from another planet, a man walked up and asked, "Would you like to go to where Swami is?" She nodded. So Judy was trying out drugs to stay high forever, and that pamphlet of Stay High Forever was the one which got her to Prabhupada. At the storefront, one of the devotees offered Judy some prasadam, a chapati, and invited her up to Swami's room. Upstairs, she entered the large front room, which was filled with fragrant smoke. There were tall flower vases, and sesame seeds were on the floor. She saw the Swami bow before the little picture of Lord Chaitanya and his associates, and then stand and leave the room, closing the door behind him. Judy decided that he must have been bowing to the floor itself. After her, everyone was softly chanting on beats, and although she couldn't make out the words, it seemed peaceful. One of the Swami's disciples told her she could come into the back room, and she followed, curious. The Swami was sitting there on his mat, looking effulgent. There was about 10 other people in the room. Prabhupada asked her if she liked the chanting in the park, and she replied, "I loved it." "Do you live nearby?" he asked. "Near here." Judy flashed on her idea that she was the all-pervading truth and answered in a way which she thought have sounded very mystical. "Oh, I live very near." "Good, Swamiji," said Swamiji. "Then you can come for our morning kirtan and class." Then she realized that she didn't live so near and that it would mean traveling an hour and a half from Bronx to visit the Swamiji. But she decided that since he had asked her, she would come. Then she thought, I am making this up. But Prabhupada assured her, as if knowing her thoughts, this process is nothing you have to make up. It's very old, very simple, and sublime. He leaned back. We are eternal, he said, and everything around us is temporary. Judy was now coming down from the LSD. But the time she left the Swami, it was late. She had wanted to stay overnight, but the boys hadn't allowed her. But she was determined to join. For Bob, it seemed natural to follow up on what he had seen in the park. He began attending the evening classes and he started reading the Bhagavatam at home and chanting. He framed the picture of the Bhagavatam dust jacket depicting the spiritual sky and placed it on his small homemade altar. He would offer flowers before the picture and sit before it chanting Hare Krishna. Bob was fascinated by the philosophy and the books and the classes, and from the very beginning, he was amazed that Swamiji's teachings answered all his questions. He listened carefully and accepted. It seemed like once I had decided that he was telling the truth, I just accepted everything he said. Not that part of it was the truth and the rest of it would have to think about. So slowly and slowly, Bob is getting realizations of how to advance in Krishna consciousness. Just like Arjuna expressed that Sarvam etad ritam manye yanmam vadasi Keshava. Just like Krishna, whatever he has spoken in Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna accepted everything. Now Bob has started accepting whatever Prabhupada has told as what he says, the truth. October 19th, it was Monday evening after the Sunday Kirtan in the park, and Dan arrived at the storefront for Kirtan. The Kirtan was in full swing, and when he entered, the first thing he noticed was some people playing on in the innards of an upright piano leaning against an wall near to the door. So if we meet those devotees who were initial days of ISKCON, this is a constant thing which you will hear. The Kirtan was in full swing. Those days when Prabhupada used to arrive or leave, or any instant it might be, the Kirtan was in like full swing. Full swing in the meaning, anybody who comes to the Kirtan feels like joining it. Nobody can resist that spiritual experience of joining the Kirtan. Then came the Swami's lecture, which Dan thought was long and serious, about how sexual desires causes bondage and suffering. The temple was crowded and stuffy, and Dan was shocked by the lecture, but he stayed on because he knew that there would be another Kirtan. He felt uneasy that the Swami's followers were all celibate. But because he liked the Kirtan, he resolved to keep coming. The Swami wasn't quite what Dan had expected. He had imagined something of light-hearted Zen Roshi, laughing and joking with sparkling eyes and words filled with paradoxes. But he found the Swami was just opposite. He was very straightforward and even cutting in his speech, and his mouth turned down at the corners, making him look mournful. Dan happily took to the Kirtans, thinking they would aid his impersonal meditation. But the lectures kept stressing that God was a person. Dan resisted. He mentally debated with Prabhupada. He was partial to Dr. Radha Krishna's interpretation of the Gita, and yet the Swami often launched ruthless attack against such impersonal ideas. Gradually, Don saw his impersonal barrier crumble, and he came to admit that on every count the Swamiji was right. Hmm? So when Prabhupada was preaching in West, there were even people influenced by Mayavadi ideas of Indian philosophies. Hmm? Seemingly, the politicians' books of Gita and even Buddhist meditation were present at that time. And look what Satsvarup Maharaj uses this word. He says as ruthless attacks against impersonal ideas. Hmm? So I don't remember that devotee's name. He used to come to Juhu Beach every time when Prabhupada used to walk on Juhu Beach in the morning. And he used to present also some Mayavadi's ideas of what God is. Patil? Yeah, Dr. Patil. He used to present Mayavadi ideas. And Prabhupada, again, in the same tone, ruthless attack, he used to smash his ideas. Hmm? So he always used to argue that everything is one. So how can you have a personal God? Hmm? So Prabhupada always used to explain that God is personal and everything belongs to him. Does not mean that everything is God. Hmm? So at one point of time, there was a very ruthless attack, I can use this word, of Prabhupada on this guy. So Prabhupada always used to tell, yes, everything is one. In your body, everything that belongs to your body is your body. Everything is one. So will you eat from the back and omit from the front? Then we can accept your philosophy. Something like that Prabhupada said. So Prabhupada used to ruthlessly attack these Mayavadis. And even at the cost of losing people, Prabhupada used to attack Mayavadis. And at one point of time when Prabhupada did such ruthless attack, one of the Prabhupada disciples told that, Swamiji, you have beaten up this guy philosophically so much that he might not come back to our classes again. So Prabhupada said, it does not matter. I gave him the right thing. Right? So sometimes you will see Prabhupada was so ruthless. This is continuation. Judy began attending both the morning and evening classes. She had to rise by 5 o'clock and get to the storefront on time, and her mother and father protested. But Judy didn't care. She would ride an hour and a half on the subway before dawn downtown to Swamiji's meetings, where she would be the only girl present. When the Swami heard that Judy was an art student, he asked her to paint for Krishna. She set up a canvas in the front room for the apartment, and under his guidance, she began painting. For her first assignment, he asked her to paint the portrait of Guru Maharaj, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati. He gave her a photo and instructed her there should be a flower garland around the Guru Maharaj's neck. The tulsi should be yellowish, not white, and there should be no effulgence or halo around his neck. So Prabhupada is giving her this guidance of how to paint Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Maharaj's photo. So sometimes you see the Mayavadis gurus are very fond of making their photos, and behind the photos they keep some some round yellow light coming out of their head, like that. So Prabhupada did not like this idea, that they keep the guru's photograph and they put some light around the neck, around the face. Prabhupada did not like that. Bob, I began chanting and studying the Srimad Bhagavatam at the home and attending the Kirtana and classes at the storefront. After the last Kirtana in the evening, Swamiji would take a bowl made of simulated wood and a little pranking knife and couple of apples that had been sitting on the edge of his lectern. And he would cut the apples into the little bowl and hand the bowl to a disciple. The disciple will then offer him the first piece and would pop into his mouth. The rest of the pieces of apple would be distributed to the crowd. I remember one time when he was chewing his piece of apple and he spit the seeds out on the floor up against the wall. They bounced off the wall onto the floor next to the dais, and I was thinking, how wonderful. No one else can do that. No one else would have had the nerve to do such a thing. Hmm. When his aesthetic aesthetic filmmaker's eye, Dan appreciated Swamiji's manner. Dan, there was a sink right next to the dais where he sat. It was close that he could have leaned over and touched it. After the cutting an apple, he would take the scraps and just fling them into the sink. It was very casual. I was very impressed by that. And one time, Brahmananda came up and wanted 50 cents for something. And Swamiji reached down and picked up his little black purse, the, the kind that closes by a metal clasp at the top. He snapped it open, looked inside very per- perspiciously, and then his hand came up like a bird, like an angel hovering in the fling above its prey. But the hand don't pounce. It just delicately drifted down, took a 50-cent piece, and rose up again as if it were being lifted up on a balloon. It was graceful. It was a dance, a ballet. He just picked up this 50-cent piece and lifted into the Brahmananda's hand. I couldn't believe it. Someone asked you for a 50-cent piece, you just dig it into your pockets and throw it at them. But Swamiji seemed to treat everything as Krishna's property, and this 50-cent piece was treated with such care. Hmm? So 50 cent means half of a dollar, if I'm not wrong. Hmm? So when Brahmanand Swami asked a half of a dollar for something, Prabhupada cared for the half of the cent as if it is Krishna's property. Hmm? The weeks went by. Some of the devotees had spoken to Bob about initiation, and he was unsure. Hmm? He didn't know what exactly initiation was, but it seemed to him that the other devotees were eager to get him initiated because he was working and had a family. To Bob's way of thinking, he represented maturity to them, a middle class American, and they were eager to land him. Bob's wife wasn't interested, and his friends were downright opposed. He couldn't spend much time with Prabhupada or devotees since he was either at the office or at the home with his family. Bob, so they were asking me if I was interested in initiation. I said I would think about it. I hadn't stopped smoking. I hadn't made the final decision. Hmm? The first real personal exchange I had with Swami was when I asked for initiation. The rest of the time, I was so much into awe of him that it didn't occur to me to say anything. I always wanted to. I felt puffed up and I always thought, well, I should be able to talk to him. Maybe I should do something. But I was always kind of reluctant to do it. I didn't think it was my place. I guess maybe I was afraid. But I was getting up early and chanting 32 rounds a day, many of them on the subway. I was afraid of the material world because I didn't have much association with devotees and I wanted to insulate myself by chanting more. Hmm? Surprising enough, right? I was chanting 32 rounds but still had not given up smoking. Hmm? Judy was another person who was considering initiation, and I asked her what she was going to do about it, and she said, I am thinking about it. And then she told me she had decided she would get initiated and give up all her bad habits. I had begun to think maybe I could give up these things too. So I asked what to do. How do I approach him? And Kirtanananda said, well, you go up to his room. I was surprised it was so easy. Hmm? In those days in Krishna consciousness, lucky, fortunate people of America could just climb a few stairs and go and meet Prabhupada. Hmm? I had prepared a little speech in my mind. My dear Swamiji, Would you kindly accept me as your disciple and teach me about Krishna consciousness? I went up to his room without an appointment and knocked the door. I heard him say, "Come in." I entered the room. He was sitting behind his desk. He was alone. I made obeisances and looked at him and said, "Yes." And I said, "Swamiji, would you make me your disciple?" And that's as far as I got. I was going to say, "And teach me the philosophy of Krishna consciousness." But he didn't let me finish my speech. He said, "Yes." It was so simple. I thought, well, there is nothing else to say. He accepted me. So I thanked him and paid my obeisances and left. Such a lucky person. You know, you are not supposed to be up here unless you are initiated, Achyutananda said. Judy was flustered. She had come upstairs to put some dirty pots in the kitchen. "Oh, yes," she replied. "That's just what I wanted to talk to Swamiji about." And she went into Prabhupada's room where he was talking with a few other people. "Swamiji, could I please get initiated?" she asked. And he said, "Do you know the four rules?" "Yes." "Can you follow them?" "Yes." "Then you can be initiated in 2 weeks." Hmm? Just imagine that fortune. Nowadays in Krishna consciousness, the preaching has expanded so much that when a candidate asks for initiation, sometimes we are told wait for 2 years. Sometimes I have seen even devotees waiting for 20 years. Hmm? Dan was also thinking about initiation, but he wanted to wait. He was chanting 16 rounds and attending all the classes, despite his reluctant wife. He had always had difficulty with authority figures, but he could feel that Swamiji was winning him over and wearing down his impersonal barrier. 2 weeks later, Prabhupada held another initiation ceremony, and Bob became Rupanuga, Judy became Jadurani, Dan needed a little more time. So, probably this is the second initiation ceremony. Should be Radhashtami or sometime later. And the first initiation was 1996 Janmashtami, if I'm not wrong. I don't remember. If Anand Prabhu remembers, he can recollect. First initiation was 66 Janmashtami, and the second was Radhashtami, somewhere like that. So this is the initial encounters which Prabhupada disciples had, and where we can see closely that if we are attached to a very saintly person, all our bad habits start leaving us. Whether that be LSD, whether that be any kind of smoking habit and other things. So this is the power of a saintly person. Just by his presence, Prabhupada did not have to open a center of drug, what is that center called? Drug de-addiction centers. So Prabhupada just chanted Hare Krishna, and the Hare Krishna Mahamantra chanting itself was sufficient to purify them for all their inauspicious situations. So this is what we can complete our today's reading, and the next next Ekadashi, we can start from the next chapter, chapter 10, Beyond the Lower East Side. So this is where the Krishna consciousness is just budding. Like when we want to lit a big fire, if there is a big firewood, when we want to burn it to ashes, initially we may have to light the fire and protect it with hands. So it seems it is in that stage. Once the log of wood starts burning, it just completely takes over. So before that happens, this is the initial phase of Krishna conscious movement. So thank you all very much for giving your time for today's morning Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita reading. If Anand Prabhu would like to add anything to these recollections, we will be very happy to hear initial days of Krishna consciousness. Mike? Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Srila Prabhupada ki.